The truth, though, is the more protected I am, the less vulnerable I am, and so therefore the less transformed I will be. And we mentioned in the last podcast this idea that the thing about vulnerability that is so overwhelming and intimidating is when I am vulnerable, I can either be healed or I can be hurt. I cannot be healed if I'm not vulnerable. I have to express the need. I have to expose the pain. I have to even feel the pain in order to be healed. And so that vulnerability does have the possibility of leading to healing. But the reality is I don't know if I'm going to be healed or I don't know if I'm going to be hurt. And my story tells me there's a good chance I'm going to be hurt again. And that's where that protection comes from.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be back with you today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller.
It's good to be here.
It's great to see you. And a return guest, Dr. Josh Moon from the staff here at Faithful and True. We twisted his arm. We paid him under the table. There were all kinds of
things.
Did we really? Yeah, that'd be great. I have to pay more attention under the table. Is that what he's saying? We're going to continue the conversation we started on our last podcast about the subject of vulnerability.
Yeah, right. And if you weren't listening last time, and we would encourage you to listen to the first podcast, because we talked about this theology of vulnerability and just acknowledge the reality that we are vulnerable, that that's who God created us to be. It is a part of God's intentional creation. And it's in that vulnerability as we live in that space that we are able to be transformed. And Jesus is the model of that Jesus modeled for us what it was to be vulnerable and the power of that. Well, we're going to continue the conversation about vulnerability, and we're going to put it in the context of recovery. And one of the things that we tell the men here is that without vulnerability, there's not recovery, there's not transformation.
That's right.
And so one of the things that we work on here at Faithful and True is we want to create a space where people are safe enough so that they can be vulnerable enough, so that they can be transformed enough that they're willing to risk again. Mm-hmm. And that really is the pattern of what it means to be transformed. And it starts with that acknowledgement of my vulnerability. So as you began your own journey of recovery, Josh, what were some of the awarenesses, thoughts that you had about your own vulnerability in the context of recovery?
Yeah, I had the great gift of my recovery starting with a very public, terrible crash and burn.
Right.
And so I had my vulnerability just ripped open and revealed to everybody who knew me here, everybody in my church community, my family and extended family, and it was just all the armor ripped off completely.
Right.
And the worst, ugliest things that I didn't want anybody ever to know, especially not me. Well, now everybody knows, and especially me.
Right.
And so I didn't see that as a gift.
Right.
And sometimes it's hard to see gifts as gift. Or does it come with a...
I'd like to return this.
Yeah. But the gift of that was, took months to get to, but I got to start with all the armor getting ripped off. And then it just becomes, well, who am I?
Right.
Like, what do I do now? Because I didn't know how to be me.
Right.
Without all of these layers that I built up and to try to protect. And now, thoughts of suicide. Because the truth is, I was hurt a lot. I came to that armor, honestly, as it were. I had a lot of experiences in my childhood and growing up that meant I knew how hard being vulnerable was. And I don't mean how hard it is to pursue vulnerability, but just the fact that I am vulnerable in the world, I knew how terrible that can be for somebody, for a child, for an adult.
Right. And well, one of the things that we're aware of is the more protected a person is, the more wounded they've been. And so for us that have had significant woundedness, we learn early on to develop these protective strategies. And my story is very similar to yours, a very public explosion. Within days, many people knew, what was going on. And same thing, that sense of this unwanted gift, that it was the idea that no one would choose this. But once I found myself in that space, because one of the things that I was aware of is I had created a system and basically created a prison in which I lived based upon these core beliefs that I had. Mm-hmm. This belief that nobody could really know me, and if people knew me, they would reject me, and that I had to figure things out by myself, and just whatever those core beliefs were. So I had this prison of isolation, and the best gift in the explosion was it began to deconstruct that prison that I'd created through my deception. One of the conversations that Beth and I would often have is, one, who would we have told if we had had that as an option? And the other is, would we have had the courage to tell anyone? And so for those of you that are listening, and you would say you were exposed, we know that there are those stories where there's a lot of consequences, there's a lot of exposure, and maybe you're in the midst of that chaos, and there is a gift in that deconstruction that is forced upon you. You have to live into that truth because it's been so public. We just want you to know there's hope. There is life outside of that chaos. And for those of you that are doing what I refer to as stealth recovery, there aren't a lot of people who know. You're trying to do it with very little consequences. It's still possible, and it is challenging because there is this small space in which you're trying to do recovery. And it takes courage to include people. It takes courage to share your story with people who don't know your story. And that is the moving towards and acknowledging the truth of your vulnerability.
Yeah, and I'm going to connect that to our theology of vulnerability. God created us as vulnerable creatures, not by accident, but a clear reason is because he wants us to care for others and to be in the care of others. Mm-hmm. And so the beauty of that image of a world, you can imagine a world, right, where people are naked and safe. Mm-hmm. Little kids run on the beach and we have to tell them to be clothed because we know the world isn't a safe place for them.
Right.
Well, imagine if it was. And the beauty of that, where vulnerability is everywhere and everyone's is okay with it because the world is safe. Well, that's what and we get redeemed back into that because it's connection.
Right.
It's about being with others, and I don't have to hide.
Well, we talked about this last time, it's the imagery from Genesis about this paradise where people were naked and unashamed, that they were living in that state of vulnerability. They were living as God intended. And it wasn't until chaos entered in that they felt like they had to cover up and hide. And so we've been living this life of hiddenness since then, but that's not what we were created for. That was not the intentional design. We have had to move towards that because of this fear that we have of living in the truth of our vulnerability.
Yeah, and I want to speak especially those of you who are listening who have known abuse. That's what comes to mind particularly. Mm-hmm. Have known abuse and known just how unsafe the world is and how terrible it is to feel so vulnerable. To say that's okay to feel that way.
Right.
Like we sometimes think God hates sin because, he's kind of a prudish aunt who you must drink your tea just so. Or, No, God hates sin because he sees what it does to the world and to his creatures. And he knows just how awful it is to be vulnerable in this world. And so why it is that we try to cover up and put on that armor, of course we do.
Right.
Of course we do. And that served us well sometimes.
Well, and it was essential. We talked about in the last podcast that when children are born, and the nature of childhood is we are dependent. We are dependent upon the adults in our lives to keep us safe. And if we have people in our life that aren't attentive, they're not protecting us, and we have people in our life that are invading us and abandoning us, then what ends up happening is the vulnerability, that place of vulnerability, we are being injured. And so I even think that God created us to have strategies of protection. I often heard Mark talk about the ability to disassociate from pain and chaos was one of those strategies. So when we are able to, as children, to disassociate, that is a way that we protect ourselves from our own vulnerabilities. And to hide, to lie, to deceive, that's another protection strategy. And so to create protection strategies or to adopt protective strategies is necessary in order to survive some of the most painful, horrific experiences of childhood.
Yeah, and I think a good imagery, again, going back to what we talked about last time and what you mentioned with the Genesis 3 episode and Adam and Eve covering themselves with fig leaves, God doesn't walk up to them and say, oh, those are ridiculous, rip them off.
Right.
How dare you do that? Try to protect yourselves in this. It exposes that they have done what they shouldn't have done. But actually, what he does is he gives them different clothing then after that. You know, it's like those leaves, they're actually not going to be they're not going to serve you well. They're going to cover you up, but they're not going to. And he actually does that wonderfully humble thing of the Creator giving them something to cover their vulnerability.
Right, and it's almost like the message is, this was not what you were created for. This is not the intention or the design, and it's a validation that given the reality, this is needed and necessary in order to be saved.
Yeah.
The truth, though, is the more protected I am, the less vulnerable I am, and so therefore the less transformed I will be. And we mentioned in the last podcast this idea that the thing about vulnerability that is so overwhelming and intimidating is when I am vulnerable, I can either be healed or I can be hurt. You know, I cannot be healed if I'm not vulnerable. I have to express the need. I have to expose the pain. I have to even feel the pain in order to be healed. And so that vulnerability does have the possibility of leading to healing. But the reality is I don't know if I'm going to be healed or I don't know if I'm going to be hurt. And my story tells me there's a good chance I'm going to be hurt again. And that's where that protection comes from.
Yeah, there's a line in a novel by Leif Anger, a good Minnesota author, where he said, he quotes Corinthians, love is patient, kind, love believes all things and hopes all things. And then it's something like, I have to paraphrase, love really stinks sometimes.
Right.
It's that acknowledgement, love hopes all things, believes all things, which means love gets disappointed sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with vulnerability.
Right.
Which is an act of love. It's embracing my being vulnerable is actually embracing, this is a world that can hurt me. Mm-hmm. And that's where wisdom then comes in. So redeeming vulnerability isn't undoing vulnerability. When God redeems us, he doesn't undo us. Grace restores nature. So what is redeemed vulnerability? Well, it's wisdom.
Right.
It's pursuing safety with wisdom and faith, hope, and love. These.
But isn't that what makes it a key component of your healing journey?
That's exactly right.
To have vulnerability as one of the cornerstones of any man's healing journey through this.
Because a big part of what we're talking, if vulnerability is the reality that the world outside can impact me, it's saying I need change. If I cannot do all the change I need within myself, I need in order for that to happen, you have to embrace your vulnerability and let the world outside impact you. And then that's where wisdom comes in.
Right. Yeah.
And I think part of our culture tells us that vulnerability is weakness. That if I'm vulnerable, I'm being weak. The reality
especially
is,
for men.
Especially
for men.
If I'm being vulnerable, I'm being courageous. And one of the things that I encourage people to do is to think of their story on a scale from 1 to 5 in vulnerability. 1 is I'm not vulnerable at all. I'm not open. I'm very limited in what I'm sharing. 5 is I'm completely open. My entire story is out there. And what I tell people is not everybody needs to be a 5 in your life. Not everybody has to know everything. In fact, there's a lack of wisdom in that. What's important, though, is that you do have people in your life that are at that place of 5. They do know you. They know your story. They know your experiences. They know your pain. They know your chaos. And so the wise adult is able to discern who is in a place of being able to steward their story.
Yeah, I think, the principle I was told long ago by a mentor of mine, love your wife, love your enemy, love your neighbor, but don't love them all in the same way.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
If you're loving your neighbor like you're never loving your wife, you're in trouble.
You're in trouble.
Right.
That's what got you in trouble in the first
come talk
place.
to us.
Yeah.
We are here to help.
Yeah, yes, we're here to help.
But it's the same, vulnerability is allowed to look like different things, because that's wisdom says, okay, I am vulnerable right now, which means sometimes that reality means I need to keep my mouth shut.
Mm-hmm.
Other times I need to open my mouth. And wisdom is that skill of living in reality,
Right.
living within what's true.
One of the things that we hear, in fact, Beth and Elizabeth did a podcast a while back on things that wives did early on in recovery that were helpful and things that weren't helpful. And one of the things that came up pretty consistently in the not helpful list was telling people that weren't able to handle the story. That many of the wives, and I think men would say the same thing, is that they felt like out of some sort of obligation, they owed their story to someone. And so they told people details, aspects of their story that they weren't really able to steward well. And the image I use is the casting of the pearls before the swine. The idea of that story is not to focus on the pigs. The pigs were just being pigs. It's about the person who had something precious and didn't either understand the value of it or didn't care about the value of it and just tossed it to the pigs. Well, when we begin to understand the beauty and the value of our own story and we handle it in an appropriate way, we want to share those pearls with people that can understand the beauty and the value of pearls. And for those that maybe discard them or not appreciate them, then it makes perfect sense we're not going to share them with them.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense. For me, I am helped by understanding it in connection with the language of intimacy. So on the last podcast, talked about intimacy as a knowledge. It's a kind of knowledge that you give that means you can hurt me. Mm-hmm. You having this knowledge of me means you can hurt me. And I'm giving it to you.
Right.
And there's a beauty and a safety and a reality in that. Well, do you pursue intimacy with everyone? Do you pursue it with your barber?
Right.
Right? Like you shared last time.
Came this close.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I don't have to pursue intimacy with everybody. And that's one of the beauties. In early recovery, you have all this energy because for the first time, I'm actually feeling okay with me.
Right.
I'm feeling okay with me. And so I'll talk to you and I'll talk to you and I'll talk to you. Or maybe I'm just so much in chaos that I'll talk to you. There's some of each. And by reframing it into, I'm pursuing intimacy. Well, okay. Then I need to use wisdom in how I do that. And boundaries now come in order to protect intimacy in different places. And that was a hard part of my recovery, and letting too many people know too many things too fast, too soon, too long a time, too many different settings. And it's been a journey because a lot of us, in textbooks, if those who experience a lot of trauma, kind of adverse childhood experiences, have difficulty with boundaries growing up. So you're everybody out or everybody in, and you go back and forth, and it's always come away, go here, come here, go away. That dynamic. It's really hard to know how to pursue intimacy, but that's the redeemed notion of vulnerability. Saying actually, it becomes a gift that creates intimacy.
Right. One thing that we absolutely encourage people to do is to get involved in groups.
Yes.
And the thing I would say is there are individuals that are trustworthy, and therefore you're going to share your story with those individuals. What's also true is there are communities that are trustworthy. They are structured to be places of vulnerability, and we trust the community. And even in the group experience, you may be involved in a group for a while before you get more into your story. And we see that in the groups that we lead, that you may go to your local SA, your Sexaholics Anonymous group, or your Celebrate Recovery group, and you just kind of observe for a while. You get a feeling for the group to determine whether or not you're going to share. One of the things that I see here, we do a men's workshop every month, and at that men's workshop, we create small groups where the men have an opportunity to share their story. And the thing I see over and over again is, I think it's two parts. One is we work really hard to create a culture of safety so that even though I'm in a room with a bunch of strangers, I'm willing to share some of the most personal and intimate parts of my story because there's a sense of safety in this space. I always say I see it as just a gift. It's a sacred space. When one of the men in the community say, I've never told anybody this before, and then they share a part of their story. I think the other piece that is a contributing factor is some anonymity. Men fly in from all over the country, and there is kind of a low-risk thing that I can share with these men this part of my story. I may never see them again. And so I feel empowered to share because of that power of anonymity. What's interesting, though, is what we see over and over again is that men have such a powerful experience here. When they leave, they take that community with them.
Exactly.
And so part of the dynamic is, for those of you that are resistant to community, we often say community is not an option in recovery. If there's no community, then there's no recovery. And part of that is we all need that safe space where we can reclaim our identity and vulnerability so that we can experience the healing that we're hoping for.
Yeah, and was brought home to me recently. My wife and I watched the movie A Star is Born. I don't know if those of you who are listening, if you've seen it, there's some really hard things in that film. It's not going to be for everyone, but it's a story of addiction. And he goes to treatment at one point. It's a really powerful story. At one point he goes to treatment, and what made me angry watching the movie, I got angry because he walked into treatment so isolated. His fame isolated him, his addiction isolated him, his own demons of the voices in his head and his scarred past and a childhood issues, all of this stuff. He was isolated. He came into recovery and they found some kind of sobriety and some hope and walked out isolated. Like the truth that he found some good things, but walked in isolated, walked out isolated. He was running away from his vulnerability his entire life. And at the place where they should have allowed him community and belonging, he walked in and he walked out, and he was just as alone on both ends. And that's what I love about our worship. Like, we are structured to invite people not to do that.
Right.
To walk in to community when you're here and walk out having community where it's a safe place to embrace that you are and have been vulnerable your whole life.
Right.
And there's a goodness to it, a beauty to it.
One of the things that we talk about is if we are not living in authentic community, we are living outside of God's intention. That God's designed in our DNA, just like eye color, just like hair color, any aspect of who we are, community is in who we are. So if we're not living in community, we're living outside of God's design. And anytime we are outside of God's design, it's going to create chaos and disruption. And so it makes perfect sense. And this is one of the things that we often say at the workshop. Given your story, it makes perfect sense you make the choices that you do. And so therefore, because of the hurt, because of the rejection, because of the criticism, because of the judgment, it makes perfect sense that you determine kind of that Scarlett O'Hara moment, as God is my witness, I will never depend upon anybody again. But the problem is that commitment, that pledge that you made to yourself is actually creating more chaos than hope. And so it's reframing it to say, I'm seeking to live in safe community. If I am isolated, I am not safe. And that's one of the things that as addicts we believe, the only time I'm safe is when I'm isolated. And so we have to reframe it to say, actually, when I'm in isolation, I'm not safe. When I'm in safe community, that is when I am safe.
And that was my experience here. that was my experience, and it still is. Was just here with Chad, who's on staff here as well, and he and I came into Faithful and True together. It'd be fun to do a podcast. The two of us, we could tell a story.
The stories I could tell.
But he and I are part of a group of men that still get together, and we meet for coffee on Wednesday mornings now, and it's shifted when we meet, how often, but we still get together so many years, a decade plus into recovery. We still get together because these are men with whom I learned the beauty of intimacy, where I walk in and I know I'm vulnerable. They know I'm vulnerable. They're okay with the things about which I'm most vulnerable in the world, and they're okay with it. They love me, and they meet with me where I am, and I do the same for them. And so that experience of safety, not as putting on as much armor as I can, isolating, finding the walls to be as big and as thick as I can that keep the world away from me. It's actually having men who sometimes their role is to keep the world away from me, but that's not my role. And they help me with wisdom and grace. And like you said last time, when grace is vague, or when our sin is vague, grace is vague. When our intimacy is vague,
our hope and healing is vague.
We can't pursue healing. We can't find it.
One of the things that I believe is there are certain spaces that when we step into that space, we are living in our vulnerable self. And I refer to this as the threshold of vulnerability. Faithful and True is one of those places. You know, it's our name is on the building. When people come to our workshop, they know what the workshop is about. And so tomorrow morning, we're going to have a workshop. This community of men are going to show up. And every time they drive up, that Uber drops them off, they step into this space, they are moving towards their vulnerability. If you go to your own support group, your Celebrate Recovery, your life group, every time you step into that space. And what's interesting is even now that we're using technology to click into the room, I've attended some support groups using technology, and as that attendee clicking in, pushing that Zoom link, I'm stepping into this space. That is a place of vulnerability. And one other thing, in our context, we've talked a lot about men. What we also know is this vulnerability piece is huge for our wives. We could very easily have the women here at Faithful and True do a very similar podcast that just like for men, vulnerability is what leads to healing. It's the same that is true for women. And listening to Deb and Elizabeth and Susie and my wife, what we're aware of is it is challenging to know who to tell. It is difficult when it feels like your story is taken away from you. It's also difficult when you are trying to hold the story and not sure who you should share it with. But the same principle is true. If there's not vulnerability, if there's not openness, if there's not transparency, then there's not going to be transformation.
Well, if you're seeking that transformation that Greg and Josh have been talking about, we invite you to visit faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources that we can offer you. We also direct you to the workshops, to our Men's Journey workshop that Greg mentioned. We offer and host that every month. And tomorrow, we're in the month of June currently as we're recording this podcast. And take a look at the schedule, because we offer this event every month. And we would love to have you come and start your healing journey to explore and discover and reveal your vulnerabilities as well. We thank you for joining us today. We thank you for joining us every time and watching and listening to these podcasts. We hope that what we are providing to you is guidance and hope and reassurance. So we invite you to join us on that journey. Until then, we hope that this coming week for you will be a week filled with many blessings and with great vision.